What if a company of merchants conquered an empire? In 1600, while the Mughal Empire ruled India in splendor, English traders arrived with ambition disguised as business. Through decades of calculated moves, from humble factories to puppet kings, they transformed from guests to masters. The violence at Plassey in 1757 changed everything. Blood-soaked battlefields gave way to treaties signed under duress, while railways and telegraphs cemented control. Behind this conquest lies a tale of brilliance and brutality that reshaped two nations forever. Discover how a tiny island subjugated the jewel of Asia through patience, paper, and powder. Before the English ever dreamed of empire, they dreamed of India. Sailors spoke of a place where the air smelled of cinnamon and cardamom, where silk shimmered brighter than the Thames in sunlight, and where palaces of marble floated upon water. To the merchants of London, the word India was not a country, but a promise. The edge of the known world where profit met paradise. And yet, when their first ships rounded Africa, the subcontinent they approached was not waiting to be conquered. It was already the heart of a world power. Under Emperor Akbar, the Mughal Empire was a living mosaic of tongues and creeds. Persians, Rajputs, Afghans, and countless others bound by imperial order. From Kabul to the Bay of Bengal, caravans moved like clockwork beneath domes of copper and gold. Cities such as Agra and Lahore gleamed with pleasure, gardens and courtyards where water whispered over marble. At Fatehpur Sikri, Akbar's red sandstone capital, scholars debated scripture in courtyards open to every faith. Revenue from Bengal's rice plains and Gujarat's textile looms poured into the imperial treasury, turning India into the richest realm on earth. Beyond those gilded borders, Europe was hungry. The Portuguese had already anchored along the western coast for more than a century, their forts at Goa and Diu serving both as altar and arsenal. The Dutch followed soon after, carving enclaves at Pulicat and the Spice Islands. To London's new class of merchant adventurers, these southern seas seemed like the future itself. So, on a frost-bitten December morning in 1600, Queen Elizabeth I signed a parchment that would alter history. Her royal charter granted the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies the right to sail east, trade freely, and wage war in defense of profit. Thus was born the English East India Company. A company, not a kingdom, yet one already dreaming in imperial scale. Their first voyages were acts of faith as much as seamanship. Ships like the Red Dragon and the Hector braved tempests and scurvy to reach the Indian Ocean, guided by half-torn maps and rumour. When at last they sighted the hazy coastline near Surat, they saw not wilderness but order. Mughal harbours crowded with Arab dhows, Gujarati traders, and Portuguese galleons heavy with pepper. To these waters came Captain William Hawkins in 1608, bearing letters and gifts for the emperor, whose favour could make or break them. Hawkins's arrival was more supplication than conquest. In Agra, he was ushered through scented halls to stand before Emperor Jahangir, Akbar's son, whose court glittered with mirrors, peacock thrones, and Persian calligraphy. The Englishman's wool and glass trinkets seemed crude against the empire's opulence. Yet Jahangir, amused by the novelty of these northern strangers, granted them permission to trade under strict Mughal supervision. They could build a factory, not a fortress, and only in Surat. For the company, this single foothold on India's coast was triumph enough. Meanwhile, the Portuguese watched their new rivals with suspicion, their Jesuit priests warning Jahangir that the English were heretics and pirates. Cannon smoke soon mingled with incense. By 1612, English and Portuguese ships exchanged broadsides off the Gulf of Cambay, and the Mughal fleet, intrigued by the newcomers' skill with gunnery, allowed the victors to stay. Thus, diplomacy began to turn into calculation. To strengthen their position, the company sent a more polished envoy, Sir Thomas Roe. He reached the Mughal court in 1615, dressed not as a trader, but as an ambassador of kings. His letters bore the seal of James I. His gifts, telescopes, carved glass, fine English cloth, symbolized Europe's craft. Roe learned quickly that persuasion in India was measured not by words, but by patience. He bowed, he waited, he paid. Slowly, through dinners, hunts, and long audiences scented with rosewater, he secured imperial farmans, decrees granting the company freedom from certain taxes and permission to trade in peace. When he departed in 1619, he left behind more than an agreement. He had taught the English how to navigate empire through etiquette. For the next half-century, the company learned its lessons in humility. India's markets ran on credit and trust, on brokers who knew which village produced the finest indigo or silk. London's merchants, accustomed to ledgers and signatures, had to learn to bow before Gujarati banyans and Armenian financiers who could bankrupt them with a rumour. The British flag was still a curiosity beside the Dutch tricolour and the Portuguese cross. Profit depended on behaving well, or appearing to. Even so, the English began to think in terms of permanence. When King Charles II married Catherine of Braganza of Portugal in 1661, her dowry brought not gold, but geography, the islands of Bombay. To London's merchants, these were the true jewels of the marriage. 7 islands, swampy and mosquito-ridden, but with a deep harbour perfect for anchorage. In 1668, Charles transferred them to the company for a mere £10 a year, little guessing that Bombay would become the Crown's greatest port east of Suez. From its muddy beginnings grew a city of bastions, warehouses, and cannon-lined quays, where merchants from Muscat, Basra, and Surat met beneath English guns. Madras followed the same pattern. On the Coromandel coast, Francis Day and Andrew Cogan purchased a strip of land from the Nayak of Punamali and built Fort St. George, another factory that slowly became a fortress. Around its walls gathered Indian weavers, brokers, and soldiers who lived by the rhythm of company silver. The English were still minor players, but their settlements had begun to feel like colonies in embryo. By the late 17th century, ambition outpaced prudence. The Mughal Empire under Aurangzeb stretched wider than ever, from the Deccan to the Hindu Kush, but its tolerance had hardened into orthodoxy, and its bureaucracy strained to manage the vastness it ruled. The company, flush with profits, misread the balance of power. In 1686, believing its naval guns could compel new concessions, it attacked Mughal ports from Bengal to Bombay. The emperor answered not with diplomacy, but with siege. His fleet blockaded Bombay. His armies shut the English factories. His officials seized their goods. For the first time, the company faced the full weight of Indian sovereignty and learned what defiance cost. The episode became known as Child's War, after the company's governor, Sir Josiah Child, whose arrogance had sparked it. The result was humiliation. The English sued for peace, paid heavy indemnities, and humbled themselves before Aurangzeb's court. In the emperor's eyes, they were merchants again, not rivals. Yet among those merchants, a new awareness had taken root. Trade alone could no longer guarantee security. Guns and diplomacy would henceforth walk hand in hand. By the turn of 1700, The English presence in India still fit within a handful of fortified towns: Surat, Madras, and Bombay. Around them stretched the unbroken dominion of the Mughal crown, its wealth still vast, its armies still magnificent. But beneath the marble calm, something subtle had begun to shift. The company's clerks were no longer simple traders. They were record keepers, tax farmers, and minor governors in waiting. Every ledger was a prelude to a treaty, every warehouse a fortress in disguise. And somewhere beyond the horizon, in the wind that filled their sails, the English heard a whisper of empire. When Aurangzeb the Great died in 1707, his empire was already fraying beneath the weight of its victories. For half a century, the Mughals had expanded faster than they could govern, building mosques and fortresses from Kabul to the southern seas. Yet what had once been a realm of order began to tremble under its own perfection. Behind the marble facades, treasuries were emptying, officers hoarded spoils, and the patience of provincial nobles turned thin as silk. Across the Deccan Plateau, old enemies rose again. The Marathas, whom Aurangzeb had spent decades trying to subdue, turned their raids into campaigns, and their campaigns into a confederacy. From their hill forts came swift riders who could melt into the monsoon mists and reappear 100 miles away by morning. To the north, the Rajputs weighed their allegiance. In Bengal, where the delta's rivers shimmered like mirrors, new men rose from the world of accountants and merchants, governors who collected imperial taxes in their own names. The emperor's death left no single heir with his authority. Succession wars followed, bitter and confused, each prince claiming divine sanction, each backed by generals who measured loyalty in silver. Palaces became battlefields, and battlefields became markets for allegiance. The imperial canopy still stretched wide, but its poles were cracking. While the Mughals bled from the top, others built from below. In Hyderabad, Asaf Jah I, the man who would be called the Nizam, declared that his service to the crown would continue, but his obedience would not. By diplomacy as much as defiance, he carved a state within a state, ruling from the Charminar's shadow, with the air of an emperor in miniature. In the west, the Maratha Peshwas tightened their grip over the Deccan, extending tribute lines deep into Gujarat and Malwa. Armies once hired to defend began to rule instead. Far to the east, Bengal grew into a kingdom in all but name. Murshid Quli Khan, a former accountant turned Nawab, made his capital at Murshidabad, where river barges carried more treasure than Delhi's caravans once had. He turned revenue into art, palaces that gleamed above the Bhagirathi, mosques laced with enamel and gold. When Alivadi Khan succeeded him in 1740, Bengal's prosperity was unmatched. Its weavers clothed the world in muslin fine as mist. Its treasuries could pay for 100 campaigns. Yet its wealth was also bait. Into this fragmented landscape came the Europeans, cautious at first, but hungry. The English East India Company, having survived its humiliation under Aurangzeb, now presented itself as the model of obedience. Its agents called themselves servants, its settlements mere factories. But behind the walls of Fort St. George and Bombay Castle, clerks were turning merchants' ledgers into maps of influence. Their rivals, the French Compagnie des Indes, followed the same pattern, raising their own fort at Pondicherry under the canny eye of Joseph Dupleix. Every cove and harbour became a potential battlefield, every treaty a duel in disguise. In London, the company's directors petitioned the Mughal court once again. This time, they sought something more subtle than conquest, privilege. Their envoy, William Hamilton, a physician by trade, found an unlikely opening when he cured Emperor Farrukhsiyar of a lingering illness. Gratitude, in the language of courts, was best expressed in ink. In 1717, the emperor issued a new set of farmans, granting the company wide exemptions from customs duties and the right to trade freely in Bengal, Gujarat, and the Deccan. What seemed a reward for medical skill became an economic revolution. The privileges looked modest on parchment: reduced taxes, permission to rent villages near Calcutta, but they cut deep into Bengal's economy. Local merchants could not compete with untaxed British goods, and Indian officials learned quickly that favours were now priced in sterling. The empire's bureaucrats, too distracted to object, let the precedent stand. Few noticed that the signatures on those farmans had bound one of India's richest provinces to the will of a foreign corporation. By the 1720s, the company's servants were not merely traders. They lent money to zamindars, purchased land in the name of native intermediaries, and managed revenue farms that once filled imperial coffers. The distinction between public duty and private gain blurred until it vanished. To their superiors in London, the flow of silver looked like success. To those who lived under their rule, it looked like another tax. The company's Indian brokers, the Banyans, the Dubashas, the money changers fluent in 3 tongues, became indispensable. They interpreted not just language, but law and custom, guiding the English through the labyrinth of Indian commerce. With them came lessons in credit, in subtlety, in the art of appearing small while growing powerful. Every clerk who sailed from England, dreaming of trade, returned, if he returned at all, with the instincts of a ruler. Yet the age remained Mughal in ceremony, if not in control. The emperor's name still appeared on coins. His farmans were read aloud at festivals. His peacock throne gleamed beneath fading sunlight. Across India, the idea of imperial unity still held the weight of religion, but belief alone could not hold armies together. Provincial courts minted their own coins, their soldiers carried their own standards. The canopy of empire still hung above the subcontinent, but its silk was thinning fast. In this uncertainty, the European companies found both peril and possibility. They needed local allies to protect their trade. They needed local wars to justify their armies. When one Nawab offered shelter, another demanded tribute. When a governor denied them privileges, a rival promised more. Diplomacy became a game of shadows, in which every side thought itself cleverer than the others. By the 1740s, the balance that had held for a century was trembling. French and English ships crossed the Bay of Bengal in restless patrols, while inland the Marathas extracted tribute from imperial cities once untouchable. The Mughal court, drained of its glory, watched from a palace it no longer ruled. The English, outwardly deferential, now kept their own soldiers at Calcutta and Madras. Guards for their warehouses, they claimed, but drilled like regulars. The French did the same. It was a quiet transformation, almost invisible at first. A few coastal forts, a handful of agreements, a web of debts and credits. And yet, within that web, the pattern of the future was already woven. For 100 years, the Mughals had been the umbrella under which all powers lived. Now the fabric was splitting, and through those cracks, the light of Europe poured in. The Indian Ocean was no longer a sea of trade. It had become a sea of empires. By the mid-18th century, the sails crowding its waters were French, Dutch, English, and Portuguese, all seeking the same prize: dominion over the markets that once belonged to the Mughals. In the decades after Aurangzeb's death, India had turned into a vast bargaining table, and every foreign flag was a hand in the game. On the Deccan Plateau, the Mughal order was collapsing into factions. The Nizam of Hyderabad ruled his territory as an independent prince. In the south, the Carnatic, a coastal strip that linked the Coromandel ports to the interior, became his subordinate province in theory, but a prize for any who could claim it in practice. From the forts of Arcot and Trichinopoly, rival Nawabs maneuvered with the precision of chess players, while far to the north, the Maratha cavalry rode where they pleased, plundering imperial treasuries already emptied by corruption. Into this confusion stepped two Europeans who understood ambition better than allegiance. One was Joseph-Francois Dupleix, governor of Pondicherry, urbane, calculating, and convinced that France could rule India through its allies rather than its armies. The other was Robert Clive, a restless clerk from Shropshire, who would one day transform a company ledger into a kingdom. But their duel was not yet begun, for now the stage was being set by a larger war that neither had started. In 1740, the death of Austria's emperor sent shockwaves through Europe. The War of the Austrian Succession, a quarrel over inheritance thousands of miles away, ignited its Indian mirror, the First Carnatic War. In 1746, French Admiral Labourdonnais arrived at Madras with a fleet bristling with cannon and purpose. His ships, sleek and seasoned from the islands of Mauritius, loomed off the Coromandel coast like thunderclouds. Within days, the English fort at Madras was surrounded by sea and silence. Inside its walls, the company's factors counted barrels of gunpowder and prayed for reinforcements that would never come. After 5 days of bombardment, the white flag rose. The city that had been their southern stronghold now flew the fleur-de-lis. When the news reached London, the directors raged. When it reached Pondicherry, Dupleix smiled. He saw in this victory not just profit, but prophecy, that Europeans could now shape Indian politics as kings, not as guests. But peace between allies is as fragile as victory. Labourdonnais, the sailor who had taken Madras, disagreed with Dupleix, the administrator who wanted to keep it. Their quarrel spilled into the open. The admiral demanded ransom and return. The governor demanded annexation. Dupleix prevailed. Madras was kept, its warehouses plundered, its merchants humbled. When the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748 restored the city to the English, the paper peace did nothing to still the ambitions it had unleashed. The French, having tasted dominion, began to interfere openly in Indian affairs. When the Nizam of Hyderabad died, Dupleix supported one claimant against another, providing troops, arms, and officers trained in European drill. His Indian allies, astonished by the discipline of French sepoys, began to see these pale-faced merchants as arbiters of fate. In return for victory, they granted Dupleix titles, territory, and the pomp of an Oriental prince. At Pondicherry, he staged processions where elephants carried French banners through streets lined with astonished spectators. Nawab Dupleix Bahadur, the court poets called him, the first European to claim Indian honors without irony. The English watched from Madras with envy and alarm. Their own fortunes in Bengal and Bombay were secure enough for trade, but the southern balance had shifted dangerously. When the throne of the Carnatic fell vacant, the company sided with Anwar ud-Din, a cautious, aging Nawab who favored peace. The French championed Chanda Sahib, younger, ambitious, and eager for revenge. Each contender marched under his foreign ally's flag, and the Carnatic, once a province of the Mughal world, became the chessboard of Europe. In 1751, the struggle reached its turning point. Chanda Sahib's forces, supported by French battalions, besieged the fortress of Trichinopoly. where Anwaruddin's heir had taken refuge. The British garrison, trapped and dwindling, seemed doomed. It was then that Robert Clive, newly returned from a near-suicidal defense of Arcot, proposed a diversion that would change everything. With just 200 Europeans and a few hundred sepoys, he would strike directly at Arcot, the Carnatic's capital. It was madness and genius. When Clive's small column approached Arcot under a sky split by monsoon rain, the city gates opened not for battle, but in terror. He seized the fort without firing a shot, fortified its walls, and waited. Within days, 10,000 men surrounded him. What followed was not a siege in the European sense, but a test of will. For 50 days, the defenders repelled assaults, fought fires, and endured hunger so severe that soldiers ground up grain husks to make powdery bread. At night, thunder rolled over the plains. By day, the British guns answered it. When relief finally arrived, the besiegers melted away, defeated not by numbers, but by nerve. Word of Arcot spread like rumor in a monsoon wind. For the first time, an Indian prince's fate had turned on the actions of a European captain with no title but courage. The company's merchants had become warriors, and India had taken notice. Duplessis, humiliated, doubled his efforts, sending reinforcements and envoys to restore French prestige. But the tide was shifting. The French treasury could no longer fund his private empire, and his own superiors began to distrust his ambitions. In Paris, they spoke of balance. In Pondicherry, he dreamed of conquest. The dream would end in bankruptcy and recall, but the method, manipulation through alliance, would outlive him by generations. By 1754, weary of war, the two companies signed a truce. The Treaty of Pondicherry restored the pre-war boundaries, but peace was an illusion. Both sides knew that Bengal, not the Carnatic, held the real prize, the richest province in Asia, where rivers glittered with gold dust and the emperor's writ was barely obeyed. What had begun as a quarrel between two trading posts had turned into a rehearsal for empire. The fields of the south lay scarred, the towns half ruined, the Nawabs indebted to their European friends. French and English officers studied each other's tactics, drilled sepoys by the thousand, and built forts strong enough to defy any local ruler. The next confrontation would not be fought for prestige or ports. It would be fought for dominion over India itself. And somewhere on the horizon, as the monsoon clouds parted over the Ganges Delta, Bengal waited, fertile, wealthy, and unsuspecting of the storm already gathering beyond its banks. By the middle of the 18th century, Bengal was the envy of Asia. Its rivers carried silver and silk. Its fields glimmered with rice and indigo. From Murshidabad to Dhaka, looms clicked through the night, weaving muslin so fine it could pass through a ring. Merchants from Arabia, China, and Europe crowded its bazaars, but it was the English East India Company that claimed pride of place. In their fortified settlement at Calcutta, they spoke of trade, not rule, yet their cannons pointed inland. For decades, the company had prospered under Alivadi Khan, Bengal's shrewd and aging Nawab. He demanded tribute, curbed their arrogance, and kept the peace that made all parties rich. But in 1756, when he died, the delicate balance collapsed. His grandson, Siraj-ud-Dawla, barely 20, inherited both the throne and the resentment that had long simmered between his court and the foreigners by the river. He was impulsive, proud, and determined to reassert control over the Europeans who had begun to behave as masters in a land that tolerated them as guests. The warning signs came swiftly. The company, fearing French attack as Europe slid once again into war, began fortifying its walls without permission. When the Nawab demanded they stop, his letters went unanswered. Private merchants, many of them company servants, ignored his customs officers, trading untaxed goods deep into the countryside. To Siraj, this was no misunderstanding of protocol. It was rebellion. In June 1756, he marched on Calcutta with 30,000 men. The defenders were merchants and clerks with muskets. Their commanders argued, then fled. After a brief, chaotic resistance, the city fell. In the captured fort, a group of English prisoners was crammed into a small cell overnight, the dungeon that later became known as the Black Hole of Calcutta. When its doors opened the next morning, most were dead from suffocation and heat. The event, exaggerated and retold in London's coffeehouses, became a legend of outrage. Bengal's war of commerce was about to become a war of vengeance. News reached Madras that autumn, carried by survivors and sailors. There, in a dimly lit council chamber, one man listened with the intensity of opportunity. Robert Clive, recently returned from his southern campaigns. Beside him sat Admiral Charles Watson, commander of the company's small but formidable squadron. They proposed to retake Calcutta by sea before the monsoon trapped their ships. London approved, not for justice alone, but for the restoration of trade. In December 1756, the fleet entered the mouth of the Hooghly River, its masts rising through mist and mangrove. Within weeks, English guns thundered again over Bengal's flat horizons. Clive's troops stormed the city and recaptured the fort by February. The settlement was renamed Fort William, its flag raised higher than before. Yet victory did not ease the tension. Siraj, alarmed by this retaliation, sought peace. But Clive's envoys were already negotiating something darker. Among Bengal's grandees, loyalty to Siraj was thin. The Jagat Seths, a banking family whose credit sustained the province, feared his temper. Mir Jafar, commander of the army, coveted his throne. Merchants whispered of change as fortune's tide turned. The English promised what the Nawab could not, stability and payment in gold. Letters were exchanged in secret. Oaths were made under lantern light. The plan was simple. When battle came, Mir Jafar's army would stand aside. In return, he would be the next Nawab under company protection. By early 1757, the British held Calcutta, but not peace. French traders at Chandernagora armed their defences, and the Nawab's court seethed with rumours of treason. Clive, still in his 30s, yet hardened by years of war, decided to act before conspiracy could unravel. In March, with Admiral Watson's ships pounding the French fortifications, he took Chandernagore after a furious bombardment. The tricolour fell, the town smouldered, and Bengal's French outpost was no more. The stage was cleared for the final confrontation. Siraj's patience broke. He gathered 50,000 men, cavalry, infantry, elephants, and guns dragged through the monsoon mud, and advanced toward the company's camp at Plassey, a village on the banks of the Bhagirathi River. Clive's force was a tenth of that number. 3,000 soldiers, most of them Indian sepoys. Between the two armies lay a mango grove and a field that would change the history of both countries. On the night of June 22nd, 1757, rain lashed the plain in sheets. Clive's officers met in council. The flicker of lanterns reflected in puddled ground. Should they fight or retreat toward the ships? The vote was divided. Clive listened, silent, then stepped into the storm. When he returned an hour later, his mind was made up. "We fight tomorrow," he said. At dawn, drums rolled through the mist. The Mughal artillery opened first, cannonballs thudding into the soaked earth, throwing fountains of mud and water. The company's line held. When the rain intensified, Siraj's gunners covered their powder. The English, using tarpaulins, kept theirs dry. As the weather cleared, Clive's batteries answered with deadly precision. Hours passed, smoke thickened, elephants panicked. And then came the turning point. Mir Jafar's divisions, drawn up in glittering ranks, remained motionless. Siraj looked for his general's banner and saw none advancing. By afternoon, confusion turned to rout. The Nawab fled the field, abandoning his camp and treasure. The battle had lasted barely 3 hours. Bengal's army, once the pride of the East, had been undone by hesitation and betrayal more than by British firepower. When Clive entered Murshidabad days later, the city's marble palaces were silent except for the rustle of peacocks in their courtyards. Mir Jafar, resplendent in borrowed glory, prostrated himself before his new patrons. The rewards were immediate and obscene. The company's coffers overflowed with restitution payments. Its officers received fortunes that in London would buy estates. Clive himself was hailed as a hero, the conqueror of Plassey. But behind the triumph lay a transformation that few yet grasped. The English East India Company had fought not as a merchant, but as a sovereign. Its army had defeated a province of the Mughal Empire and dictated who would rule it. A line had been crossed, and no treaty could uncross it. In the monsoon air that hung heavy over Bengal, the smell of gunpowder mingled with the sweetness of mango and decay. Plassey was only a grove, a dot on a map, yet it marked the beginning of empire. The merchants had become masters, and India would never again be the same. Wealth can conquer more swiftly than armies. After Plassey, Bengal's treasuries were thrown open. Vaults of silver, jeweled ornaments, strings of pearls taken not as loot but as compensation. The Englishmen who had come as traders now counted their profits by the cartload. Fort William glimmered with newly minted rupees, while London's newspapers sang of a triumph without empire, a conquest achieved in the name of commerce. Yet even as medals were struck and banquets held, the victors began to learn the cost of kingship. Mir Jafar, the new Nawab, had won his crown through promises he could not afford. The company demanded payment for its losses, its officers demanded personal rewards, and its soldiers expected higher wages. Every bag of coin delivered to the English left his own subjects poorer. To meet their claims, the Nawab taxed his people beyond endurance and debased the currency that fed Bengal's markets. What had once been a living economy became a theatre of debt. Clive, now both conqueror and administrator, pretended restraint. He wrote to his superiors that moderation was essential, and then negotiated gifts worth more than any royal pension. He installed advisors and guards around the Nawab's palace, presenting them as protection while ensuring that no decision escaped company notice. Murshidabad glittered, but its ruler had become a ceremonial figure, a signet pressed beneath someone else's hand. Meanwhile, not all of Bengal had accepted the new order. The Dutch, still entrenched at Chinsura upriver, watched with envy and alarm. Their directors in Batavia sent secret orders to curb English ambition before it swallowed the entire delta. In 1759, their flotilla of armed vessels entered the Hooghly under the guise of trade. The company intercepted them midway, and for the first time, 2 European powers fought for control of India's rivers. The battle was brief but decisive. The Dutch routed, their prestige shattered. To the people of Bengal, the message was unmistakable. The English had no equals left. Prosperity, however, began to corrode from within. The company's servants, enriched by bribes and private ventures, turned from traders into freebooters. Ships that once carried cloth now carried personal fortunes. In London, shareholders rejoiced as dividends soared, but the Bengal government slid toward anarchy. Villages were abandoned to new taxes. Petty officials extorted where they once recorded. Famine stalked the provinces, even in years of harvest. Mir Jafar, drowning in obligations, attempted to resist. In 1760, he was forced to abdicate in favor of his son-in-law Mir Qasim, a man of energy and vision. Unlike his predecessor, Mir Qasim understood the machinery of power and sought to rebuild it. He reformed the army, cut pensions to idle nobles, and tried to free internal trade from company interference. For a moment, Bengal breathed again. But reform required equality, and equality was the one thing the English would not endure. Their officers, exempt from customs, flooded the market with untaxed goods. Indian merchants, unable to compete, went bankrupt. When the Nawab's men began levying tolls on company convoys, the merchants cried, "Insult!" and Calcutta demanded revenge. War returned almost by accident. In 1763, Clive was in England, while younger officials, soldiers turned bookkeepers, carried out policy by instinct rather than judgment. The company's troops advanced upriver. Mir Qasim's reformed battalions met them with European discipline and Indian fury. At Monghir, Katwa, and Garaya, battles flared in the heat of the monsoon. But logistics favored the invaders. By autumn, the Nawab's army was broken, his treasury plundered. Mir Qasim fled west into the plains of Awadh, where his father-in-law's enemies became his allies. There he found two men who shared his grievance: Shuja-ud-Dawla, the Nawab of Awadh, alarmed at the company's encroachment on his borders, and Shah Alam II, the wandering Mughal emperor, eager to reclaim the authority his dynasty had lost. Together, they formed a coalition: Bengal's exiles, Awadh's cavalry, and the remnant of imperial prestige, to drive the foreign merchants back to the sea. In Calcutta, the English council received word of the alliance with disbelief that hardened into fear. They called for reinforcements from Patna, reorganized their scattered battalions, and placed command in the hands of Major Hector Munro. The war that followed was not a campaign of maneuver, but of attrition, fought across the fertile plains of the Ganges Valley, where every village became a supply post and every river crossing a battlefield. The decisive encounter came in October 1764, near the small town of Buxar. Morning mist hung over the Ganges as the coalition's army, 40,000 strong, stretched in glittering ranks across the plain. Opposite them, the company's 13,000 stood in disciplined silence, their flanks guarded by artillery. At sunrise, the Allied guns opened fire, shaking the earth with thunder. The British replied in measured volleys, smoke drifting low across the fields. When the cavalry charged, they met a wall of musket fire that shattered their formation. By noon, the Allied camp was chaos. Elephants stampeding, banners falling, the Emperor's standards sinking into the haze of defeat. When the smoke cleared, India's political landscape had changed again. Plassey had made the company kingmaker. Buxar made it king. Shah Alam surrendered, not to an army, but to an institution. His imperial tent became a boardroom, his seal a formality beneath English signatures. Shuja-ud-Dawla, humbled, accepted the terms dictated by men who still called themselves servants of a corporation. Mir Qasim vanished into exile, another name written off in a London ledger. The Treaty of Allahabad, signed in 1765, formalized what the battlefield had already decided. The Mughal emperor, in exchange for protection, granted the company the Diwani, the right to collect Bengal's revenues in his name. It was a clause that turned commerce into government. From that moment, taxes once gathered for the crown flowed into the company's treasury. Its clerks became administrators. Its soldiers became policemen. Its merchant's seal became the emblem of sovereignty. Back in England, the news was received with disbelief that quickly turned to awe. A corporation of traders had acquired the fiscal heart of India without a royal army, without a declaration of war. Parliament toasted their success and envied their fortune, unaware that the conquest they celebrated would soon demand an empire's burden of rule. Bengal's fields, drenched in the memory of 2 battles, glittered once more with harvests. But the grain now fed an army, not a people. What the company had won at Buxar was not peace, only permanence. The rulers of India were gone. The accountants had taken their place. The drums of conquest had faded, but the march of paperwork had begun. After the Treaty of Allahabad, the English East India Company stood not only as a merchant, but as Bengal's tax collector, the Diwan of the richest province in Asia. Its officials called the change an arrangement. The people who paid for it called it something else. For a century, Bengal's revenues had sustained emperors. Now they sustained a corporation. Villages that once sent tribute to Delhi now filled ledgers in Calcutta. The company's officers, many scarcely 30 years old, signed receipts in Persian without understanding the language, authorizing taxes they would never see collected. Behind their desks, India's old bureaucracy, accountants, scribes, revenue farmers, carried on as before, except that the seal at the top of each document now bore a lion and a crown instead of the emperor's falcon. At first, the arrangement seemed stable. The new administration kept the Mughal machinery. Indian officials assessed harvests. The company approved their sums. Silver flowed in measured streams downriver. Yet the moral logic had changed. Where once revenue had been the price of protection, it was now the price of profit. The company's council in Calcutta demanded higher returns each year to satisfy shareholders in London. To meet those demands, their native agents pressed harder upon the countryside. Landholders borrowed at ruinous interest, sold seed grain to pay arrears, and fled when they could not. In the villages, peasants spoke of a government without a king, a power that could neither be petitioned nor appeased. Even the Nawab, reduced to a ceremonial stipend, could only watch as authority passed from palace to counting house. Still, for a time, the illusion of prosperity held. The bazaar of Murshidabad glittered with jewels. The English merchants bought palaces from ruined nobles and filled them with imported glass and furniture. Banquets replaced battles. The conquerors dined under punkahs, swung by servants who had once collected taxes in the emperor's name. Yet beneath the surface, the soil was dying. In 1770, Bengal's sky turned a strange pale yellow. The monsoon failed, then failed again. Rivers shrank to dust-colored threads. Fields cracked like pottery. The famine that followed was not the first India had known, but it was the first under British rule. The company's warehouses were full, rice stored for export, not relief, and its council hesitated to interfere with the natural course of trade. Villages emptied into silence. Later estimates claimed that 1/3 of Bengal's people perished. The survivors left behind fields overrun by weeds and corpses that the crows had long since stopped fearing. The famine exposed the hollowness of the system the company had built. Its officers had authority without accountability, power without precedent. Even in London, the news could not be ignored. The directors demanded inquiries. Pamphlets accused the corporation of bleeding a province dry. In Calcutta, blame passed like a contagion. from the council to the collectors, from the collectors to the climate. But the truth was simpler. They had made government a branch of commerce, and commerce has no mercy. Amid the ruin, one figure began to rise. Warren Hastings. A company servant of long experience, he had watched Bengal's collapse with a mixture of disgust and calculation. He understood that the corporation could no longer govern by improvised greed. It required a system, rules, courts, and the appearance of justice. When he became governor of Bengal in 1772, he set about creating what he called order. He dismissed the puppet Nawab's remaining ministers and appointed company officers in their place, though he masked the change with delicate phrases. He revived the ancient title of Naib Diwan to preserve the fiction of Mughal authority, while ensuring every decision passed through British hands. Hastings then turned to the law. Hindu pandits and Muslim qazis were summoned to translate their codes into English. Thus were born the first regulations, halfway between imperial edict and legal experiment. His aim was as political as it was moral. If India were to be governed for profit, it had to appear to be governed for justice. He curtailed private trade among company servants, hoping to separate personal fortune from official revenue. He reorganized the courts, built archives, and sent young collectors into the districts with instructions written in measured prose and enforced by bayonet. It was the beginning of the company state, a bureaucracy that spoke of virtue while counting its rupees. Around Bengal, resistance flickered but could not coalesce. The Rohillas of the northern hills defied the Nawab of Awadh, who now acted as the company's shield and subordinate. In exchange for loans and promises, the English supplied his armies, testing the new machine of intervention. It was not conquest in name, but it was conquest in practice. Each loan led to a debt, each debt to territory, each treaty to dependence. The famine years left scars deeper than politics. Travelers from Europe wrote of deserted roads lined with skeletons. Bengali poets lamented rivers that flow with tears instead of fish. In Calcutta, the company's officers comforted themselves with the illusion of reform, while in London, Parliament began to sense a crisis of a different kind. The company's profits, once dizzying, were shrinking. Its officials were accused of corruption, its accounts of deceit. The same machine that had extracted a kingdom was now consuming itself. By 1773, the story of Bengal had become a moral drama in the British imagination, a tale of wealth, wickedness, and divine retribution. Newspapers spoke of nabobs, company men returning from India with fortunes built on famine. The nation that had once celebrated their triumphs now demanded their restraint. And so, the question that had been whispered since Plassey finally reached the House of Commons: could a private company rule a nation? The answer would come in statute and scandal, in wars fought by treaty and letters sealed with wax. Bengal had been conquered once by the sword. Now it would be conquered again by reform. Bengal was not yet a colony, but it no longer felt like a kingdom. In Calcutta, the hum of clerks and couriers replaced the noise of markets. Orders stamped with company seals now carried more weight than any emperor's decree. Yet, across the ocean, another power was beginning to stir: Parliament. The British public, once dazzled by the fortunes of its nabobs, had grown uneasy at the stories of famine, corruption, and misrule. The conquest that had enriched shareholders was staining the nation's conscience. In 1773, the reckoning came. After months of debate, the Regulating Act was passed, the first attempt by Britain's government to govern its own creation. The law declared that the company's territories in India were now possessions of the crown, though it left the corporation in charge of administering them. A governor-general was to preside at Calcutta with a council beside him. A supreme court would stand as the final arbiter of justice. Paper limits for a power that had learned to live without them. The first man to hold that new authority was Warren Hastings. He had already begun to reform Bengal from within. Now London gave him both license and scrutiny. His challenge was impossible: to satisfy Parliament's hunger for order while maintaining a system built on patronage. Around him, his council became a battlefield of intrigue. Some sought reform, others profit. Few could tell the difference. The new Supreme Court, staffed by English judges unfamiliar with Indian law, soon collided with the governor's administration. Arrest warrants were issued for Indian officials, native police defied them, and whole towns rose in protest. In Calcutta's streets, the rule of law looked much like chaos. While bureaucrats quarreled, the frontiers burned. Hastings understood that the company's empire, though not yet called one, could survive only through alliances and deterrence. To the north and west, new powers were rising. The Marathas, hardened by a century of war, and the kingdom of Mysore, whose rulers, Hyder Ali and his son Tipu, commanded disciplined armies and French-trained artillery. Between these realms lay a web of treaties and betrayals that the company sought to master by pen and sword alike. When the First Anglo-Maratha War erupted in 1775, it began not with declarations, but with intrigue. In the court of Poona, rival claimants fought for the title of Peshwa. The English, believing they could choose the victor, backed Raghunath Rao, a dispossessed prince who promised territory in exchange for their aid. The resulting Treaty of Surat bound them to his cause, and to a war they barely understood. Hastings, far away in Bengal, approved reluctantly. The governors of Bombay pressed eagerly. The company's troops advanced into the Deccan and found themselves swallowed by unfamiliar terrain, unending skirmishes and shifting loyalties. Months turned to years. Fortresses changed hands. Treaties were signed and broken, and no side could claim victory. At last, both armies were exhausted. The Treaty of Salbai in 1782 restored the pre-war borders and Raghunath Rao's exile, leaving behind a lesson the company would soon forget. In India, diplomacy was as dangerous as battle. No sooner had the Maratha War cooled than another storm broke to the south. In Mysore, Hyder Ali had watched English ambition creep closer to his dominions and saw his allies betrayed. When British envoys courted his enemies, he struck first. The Second Anglo-Mysore War erupted in 1780, catching the company unprepared. Hyder's cavalry swept down from the highlands with terrifying speed, burning villages and cutting the roads to Madras. It was said that his raids reached within sight of the city's walls, the first time the British felt the war's heat so near their own hearth. For 4 years, the struggle raged across southern India. Sieges at Arcot and Ambur, ambushes in narrow passes, endless marches through jungles where fever killed more soldiers than cannon shot. When Tipu Sultan, Hyder's son, took command after his father's death, the fight only sharpened. He was younger, educated in the ways of European warfare, and possessed of a pride that saw no reason to bow before merchants. His rockets, small iron cylinders bound with bamboo, screamed over the battlefield, a weapon that astonished European observers. In Bengal, Hastings watched these wars unfold. Like a gambler, watching dice, he had no choice but to throw. He sent funds, drafted alliances, and endured the rage of his superiors in London, who accused him of exceeding his powers. Yet without his improvised diplomacy, the company might have lost all of southern India. When at last the exhausted combatants signed the Treaty of Mangalore in 1784, it restored prisoners, borders, and honor, but not trust. Victory, if it could be called that, brought no peace in England. The directors of the company, furious at the cost, turned their anger on the man who had saved them. Parliament launched inquiries. Pamphlets accused Hastings of tyranny, corruption, and even murder. His reforms were painted as oppression, his diplomacy as deceit. The same empire that had demanded strong rule now recoiled from its price. Still, beneath the scandal, the structure of governance had begun to solidify. Calcutta's courtrooms echoed with new phrases: Governor-General, regulation, council. The fiction of distant oversight was giving way to the fact of British sovereignty. The Regulating Act had opened a narrow gate. Hastings and his wars had walked through it. By the mid-1780s, India was no longer a territory ruled for profit alone. It was a system, bureaucratic, militarized, and entangled with Parliament itself. A realm of treaties written in English, armies drilled in European cadence, and cities rebuilt in brick and symmetry. The company had begun to resemble the power it once feared becoming, a government. And yet, the man who had shaped that order would soon stand accused before the very state that created it. The empire he built was still becoming, and already devouring its own architects. The wars had ended on parchment, not in spirit. In the southern hills of India, where the Kaveri River cut through forests and granite, Tipu Sultan ruled from his capital at Seringapatam, a city of gardens, mosques, and arsenals. He had inherited his father's kingdom and his fury in equal measure. To his allies, he was the defender of independence. To the English, the spectre of resistance that refused to die. Tipu's court was unlike any in India. European artisans hammered muskets in his foundries. Engineers tested small iron rockets that shrieked through the air with unnatural precision. Scribes recorded decrees in Persian, laced with Arabic calligraphy. He sent embassies to the Ottoman Sultan, to Mauritius, and even to France, seeking allies among those who might yet challenge British power. His palace walls bore painted tigers devouring European soldiers. His emblem, his warning, his creed. In his hall of audience, maps of the world hung beside verses from the Quran. A ruler who saw no line between science and faith, war and governance. To the company, this was intolerable. The memory of Hyder Ali's raids still haunted Madras. The thought of another southern coalition kept Calcutta's council awake. But for a few years, diplomacy prevailed. Hastings' successor, Lord Cornwallis, the same general who had surrendered at Yorktown, now sought redemption in India. He arrived in 1786, determined to impose discipline on the company's armies and restraint on its profits. The era of conquest is over, he wrote. It was not. Cornwallis set about reforming the empire's skeleton. Salaries replaced bribes, judicial offices replaced favors, and for the first time, company officials began to look less like traders and more like governors. He also reorganized the army, creating a hierarchy that bound Indian sepoys to British command in perpetuity. The experiment worked too well. Discipline became identity. Obedience became culture. Even as Cornwallis built his administrative machine, the ground beneath it began to tremble. In 1790, a quarrel between Tipu and the company's ally, the Rajah of Travancore, gave London its pretext. The Rajah had fortified his borders against Mysore's demands for tribute. Tipu saw defiance. The English saw opportunity. Cornwallis forged a grand alliance with the Marathas and the Nizam of Hyderabad, promising protection and territory in return for their loyalty. The march began in 3 directions at once, a pincer that would crush Mysore between them. The campaign that followed was a feat of endurance. The British columns advanced through forests where leeches clung to soldiers' ankles and cannon wheels sank into red clay. In the torrid heat, sepoys collapsed from thirst beside rivers that shimmered with disease. Each fortress fell only after weeks of bombardment: Nandedurg, Savandurga, Bangalore. Names that would later fill London's newspapers as symbols of imperial vigour. Cornwallis moved like a siege made flesh, slow, relentless, inevitable. In Seringapatam, Tipu fortified his walls and vowed to die behind them. His letters flew to every corner of the subcontinent, calling for aid that never came. When the company's guns finally opened on his capital in 1792, their roar rolled for days across the valley. He fought until his ramparts cracked, then sought peace with dignity. The Treaty of Seringapatam forced him to surrender half his dominions and pay a ransom so vast that his first installment was 2 sons, boys of 10 and 8, sent as hostages to Madras. The ceremony of their handover was staged like theatre. Cornwallis, dressed in white and gold, sat beneath a canopy as Tipu's sons entered in state, their turbans bright against their sorrow. The exchange was solemn, almost tender. Portraits of that moment travelled across the empire. The British as just victors, the Sultan as noble adversary. The illusion suited both sides. But peace built on humiliation seldom lasts. Over the next 7 years, Tipu rebuilt what he could: his armies, his arsenals, his alliances. He introduced new coinage bearing the image of a roaring tiger and the motto, "Victory to God and Tipu," the sword of Islam. He corresponded secretly with Napoleon, then campaigning in Egypt, dreaming of an Eastern alliance that could drive the English into the sea. The company intercepted the letters. The news reached London like a spark in dry grass. In 1798, Lord Richard Wellesley arrived in India as Governor-General, bringing with him the rhetoric of empire disguised as policy. He was young, brilliant, and intolerant of compromise. His ambition was clear: to turn the company's fragile dominion into a British system of power. He called it the Subsidiary Alliance, a doctrine that promised protection to Indian princes in exchange for their freedom. Under its terms, rulers who accepted British friendship must host company garrisons and pay for their upkeep, while relinquishing the right to diplomacy. It was conquest written in legal prose. The Nizam of Hyderabad signed first, stripped of alternatives. The Marathas hesitated, but soon followed. Tipu refused. His pride, his faith, his history, all forbade it. He would not host a garrison, would not pay for his own chains, would not bend before men who had once been merchants. Wellesley called him obstinate. Tipu called himself free. In earlier 1799, Wellesley decided to end the question. From Bombay, Madras, and Hyderabad, 3 columns advanced towards Seringapatam. The roads filled with dust and song, cannon teams and engineers, elephants dragging siege mortars the size of cottages. Each army was a moving city: surgeons, priests, supply officers, and scribes marching in unison under the Bengal flag. The campaign was choreographed as though by empire itself. The siege began in April. British batteries thundered day and night, pounding the ramparts into rubble. Within the walls, Tipu moved among his soldiers, bareheaded, his sword flashing in the lamplight. When offered terms, he laughed. "Better to die like a soldier," he said, "than live like a slave." On May 4th, after 48 days, a breach opened near the Watergate. The storming party surged forward, Highlanders, sepoys, engineers, through smoke thick with the smell of powder and mango blossom. Tipu fell fighting in the gateway, shot through the head at close range. His body was found beneath a heap of soldiers, one hand still gripping his sword. When the guns fell silent, the victors entered the city. The treasury was catalogued, the palace searched, the archives sealed. Wellesley's younger brother, Arthur, then an untested colonel, walked through the blood-slick courtyards and took note of every wall and street, a habit that would one day serve him on other fields. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley, as if to mark the end of an age. The company restored the old Wadiyar dynasty, now a client under protection. The Nizam and Marathas took their shares of Mysore's lands. Wellesley took its legacy. Engineers studied Tipu's rockets, artisans dismantled his foundries, and his throne, carved in the shape of a crouching tiger, was shipped to London as a curiosity. Sermons proclaimed the victory as divine providence. Poets in Calcutta hailed the fall of tyranny. For the English, the conquest of Mysore was not merely territorial. It proved that empire could be made by principle as well as by powder. The subsidiary alliance became the instrument of choice, binding Indian states by treaty until resistance became treason. Every prince who signed thought himself protected. Everyone who refused became an enemy. The company no longer needed to conquer every province. It only had to make its neighbors dependent. In the bazaars of southern India, ballads of Tipu's last stand spread by word of mouth, of the king who died defending his walls while his allies feasted. Children carved wooden tigers that growled when a handle turned. Artisans painted his emblem on cloth in secret. To the British, he was a defeated tyrant. To many Indians, he became the memory of defiance. When news of his death reached London, church bells rang and Parliament applauded. The directors toasted their Governor-General and investors calculated their dividends. Yet even among the triumphant, there were doubts. Wellesley had won Mysore, but at a cost that alarmed his masters. His alliances had tripled the company's territory and its army alike. India was no longer a commercial dominion. It was a military one. The fall of Mysore's tiger marked the moment when empire ceased to be accidental. From now on, every treaty would carry the scent of gunpowder, every ally the shadow of subjection. The British had learned how to rule through others, and how to conquer without calling it conquest. The death of Tipu Sultan had not brought peace. It had only removed the last illusion of balance. Across the subcontinent, one power still stood between the company and dominion. The Maratha Confederacy, a network of states bound by rivalry as much as by blood. From the western Ghats to the northern plains, its horsemen patrolled the routes that once carried imperial tribute. They were the heirs of Shivaji's rebellion and the final guardians of India's independence. Though they spent as much time fighting one another as they did the British, after Mysore's fall, Lord Wellesley turned his attention northward. He believed the Marathas were a power of habits, not of principles, destined to dissolve under pressure. To hasten the process, he offered them the same poisoned gift that had subdued others, the subsidiary alliance. Some accepted, others resisted. Each decision became a step toward war. Long before it erupted, the conflict had already been sown. The First Anglo-Maratha War in the 1770s had ended without victory, a draw sealed by the Treaty of Salbai, which restored a fragile equilibrium. But equilibrium is not peace. By 1800, that treaty was a relic. The Maratha chiefs had grown powerful but divided. The Peshwa Bajirao II, ruler at Pune, faced rebellion within his own capital from the warlike Holkar clan. When his palace was stormed and he fled in panic, he turned for help to the one power his ancestors had vowed never to trust. The British received him with ceremony and calculation. Under the Treaty of Bassein in 1802, Baji Rao accepted a permanent British garrison near his capital and surrendered control of his foreign affairs. It was the end of Maratha autonomy disguised as protection. To his fellow chiefs, Scindia, Holkar, Bhonsle, Gaikwad, the act was treason. The Confederacy fractured. War was inevitable. In 1803, the Second Anglo-Maratha War erupted like a storm. Wellesley had planned it with precision. Twin campaigns, one led by General Arthur Wellesley in the Deccan, the other by General Lake advancing from Bengal toward the north. For the first time, the company's armies moved like instruments of a single will. Arthur Wellesley, still in his 30s, commanded with a discipline rare even among professionals. His troops marched through dust and heat, crossing rivers under fire, assaulting fortresses with grim efficiency. At Asai, a village between two streams, he faced a force more than twice his size. Maratha infantry drilled by European officers, artillery that outnumbered his own. The battle raged for hours in smoke and dust so thick that orders were carried by trumpet alone. When it ended, thousands lay dead, and Wellesley's horse was shot beneath him. He called it the bloodiest fight I ever saw. Victory at Assaye opened the road to the Deccan, and with it, a legend that would one day carry him to Waterloo. Meanwhile, to the north, General Lake advanced toward Delhi, where the ghost of Mughal authority still flickered. At Laswari, his columns smashed Scindia's armies and took the old imperial capital. The last emperor, Shah Alam II, half blind and weary, greeted the British as his protectors. He was led into the Red Fort beneath their flag. In that moment, the fiction of Mughal sovereignty ended. The company had inherited the body of empire itself. The treaties of Surji Ajungan and Deogan followed, stripping the Marathas of territory and revenue. Scindia retained his name, but not his power. The Bhonsles lost Berar. The Peshwa remained a client in all but title. Yet the Confederacy endured in fragments, restless, suspicious, proud. The British, eager to consolidate, built residencies in their capitals, posted officers who acted as advisors but ruled in fact. For a few years, the arrangement held. Calcutta celebrated its peace. London counted its dividends. But the Marathas had not forgotten who they were. When new wars erupted in Europe, the company's armies were stretched thin. The princes saw an opening. In 1817, the British campaign against the Pindaris, bands of irregular raiders sheltering in central India, became the spark for the Third Anglo-Maratha War. The Pindaris were more symptom than cause. The real question was whether the Marathas would accept the company's permanent dominance. They did not. Baji Rao II, Scindia, Holkar, and the Bhonsles hesitated between rebellion and submission. Some signed treaties under duress. Others took up arms. The rebellion spread like fire through the Deccan. At Kirki, near Pune, British troops fought under the walls of their own residency. At Nagpur, the Bhonsles' forces stormed the cantonment before being driven back. Across the heartland, cavalry clashed with cannon, the old order's speed against the new order's discipline. In the central plains, the campaign was led by Sir Thomas Hyslop and General John Malcolm, men trained in Wellesley's tradition. Efficient, unsentimental, and relentless. City after city fell. At Mahidpur, the Holkar army broke under artillery fire. At Satara, the Peshwa fled. At Kopargaon, his standards were burned. By 1818, the war was over. Baji Rao surrendered to the company's officers with quiet dignity, accepting a pension and a palace far from his capital. The last independent power of India had ceased to exist. What followed was not the exultation of victory, but the cold rhythm of administration. The Maratha dominions were parcelled into districts, each governed by a collector with a quill instead of a sword. New roads linked cantonments. Postal runners carried orders between forts. And the map of India began to resemble a grid, precise, efficient, alien. For the Indian princes who survived, the new order was both protection and imprisonment. Scindia of Gwalior, Holkar of Indore, and the Gaikwad of Baroda remained on their thrones, but under the watchful gaze of British residents. Their courts glittered with ceremony, but not with power. The company had learned from its wars how to rule through hierarchy. One sovereign in London, one governor-general in Calcutta, and a dozen kings beneath them, each a polished mirror reflecting imperial light. When the guns finally fell silent, India was no longer a mosaic of rival states, but a pattern designed from abroad. The company's armies garrisoned the plains, its political officers dictated alliances, its surveyors measured rivers and fields as if to write the land into obedience. From Delhi to Bombay, from the Vindhyas to the coast, the British flag rose above citadels built by others. Still, among those who remembered the old world, the courtiers, soldiers, and scribes displaced by the new, the silence felt like mourning. The horsemen who had once thundered across the Deccan were gone. Their descendants watched trains of camels carrying payrolls instead of plunder. The Maratha banners that had frightened emperors now hung as trophies in Calcutta's council halls. When word of the victory reached England, Parliament praised Wellesley's system as genius, a design that had tamed a continent. Few paused to ask what it meant for the people who lived within it. The British Empire in India had found its shape. Rule by treaty, war by regulation, conquest disguised as order. Somewhere in that transformation, the spirit that had resisted at Mysore, Delhi, and Pune was folded into a quiet, watchful endurance, waiting for the next storm. Peace seldom rests long upon conquest. Once the Marathas were subdued, the company's frontier crept outward like a shadow at dusk. Its officers spoke of stability, its maps spoke of appetite. Beyond the settled plains of India lay deserts, rivers, and mountains that no clerk could yet quantify. The lands of Sindh and the Punjab, where new rulers had carved states from the wreckage of empire. To London, these regions were names on dispatches. To Calcutta, they were a question of survival. The Napoleonic Wars had ended, but new fears had taken their place. The Russian Empire was pushing southward through Central Asia, and the British imagined its columns descending toward the Indus. Diplomats called it the Great Game. Merchants called it opportunity. Soldiers called it destiny. Each believed they were protecting India. Each brought the frontier closer to war. Around the 1830s, the company began to look towards Sindh, a narrow sweep of fertile ground lying between the Rajput sands and the Arabian Sea. It was ruled by the emirs of Talpur, a confederacy of Baluchi chieftains whose authority rested on fragile alliances. They collected tolls from passing caravans, traded with Persia and Muscat, and tolerated British agents so long as they behaved like merchants. But merchants had a habit of becoming masters. The pretext arrived, as always, wrapped in diplomacy. In 1838, the company sought safe passage through Sindh for its armies marching toward Afghanistan. The campaign was part of a grand design to install a friendly ruler in Kabul and to bar Russian influence from the passes beyond. The emirs consented reluctantly, signing a treaty that allowed British troops to transit their territory. They watched in sullen silence as columns of red-coated soldiers tramped through their fields, consuming grain and leaving promises of payment. When the Afghan expedition collapsed in disaster a few years later, the British returned, demanding new concessions to recoup their losses. By then, the governor of Bombay was Sir Charles Napier, a man who viewed treaties as conveniences. He called Sindh a den of robbers, and his dispatches turned suspicion into justification. Skirmishes along the border followed, small, confusing, fatal. In February 1843, at Miani, Napier's army of 2,800 men met 20,000 Baluchi warriors near the banks of the Indus. The emirs fought with courage and chaos, charging into cannon fire that tore their ranks apart. Within hours, the field was a wasteland of bodies. The survivors fled toward Hyderabad, where another battle ended the same way. Napier entered the city beneath a blazing sun and announced its annexation. "We have no right to seize Sindh," he wrote in his journal, "yet we shall do it, and a very advantageous, useful, humane piece of rascality it will be." His superiors in London chose to quote only the second half. The province was declared part of the company's dominions. The Indus became a British river. While Sindh was being subdued, events farther north drew even greater caution. Beyond the Sutlej River lay the kingdom of the Punjab, ruled by Maharaja Ranjit Singh, the Lion of Lahore. His empire was a paradox, Sikh in faith, Mughal in splendor, European in organization. French and Italian officers drilled his infantry. His artillery rivaled anything in India. Lahore's fortresses gleamed with gold domes, and its bazaars overflowed with coin minted in his name. Ranjit Singh understood power better than pride. He courted the company when it suited him, exchanged gifts, and signed the Treaty of Amritsar in 1809, fixing the Sutlej as the frontier between his realm and British territory. For 3 decades, he kept that peace. While the British consolidated Bengal and the Deccan, Ranjit forged unity in the northwest, conquering Kashmir, Peshawar, and Multan, and holding the Khyber Pass against Afghan raids. His kingdom became a buffer the British both feared and admired. But time obeys no treaty. Ranjit Singh died in 1839, and his empire began to unravel. Courtiers plotted, generals fought, and the once loyal Khalsa army grew restless, a disciplined force without a master. In Calcutta, officials watched the disintegration with a mixture of satisfaction and dread. "The Punjab cannot remain quiet," one of them wrote. "When it moves, we must move faster." Meanwhile, the company's engineers and surveyors were already tracing the lines of the future. Steamers tested the Indus waters. Depots sprang up along its banks. Experiments with railways and telegraphs began on the coasts. Small at first, but portentous. Calcutta's clerks spoke of connectivity. Generals spoke of mobilization. Technology, like trade, became an instrument of empire. In the Chis-Sutlej region, the chain of small Sikh and Rajput states lying between the two great powers, the company found its next experiment. These petty rulers, fearful of Lahore's armies, had long sought British protection. The company obliged, turning their lands into a living buffer. British residents appeared in their courts, not as conquerors, but as advisors. Troops were stationed for security, revenue standardized for fairness. In less than a decade, the Sutlej line became a frontier, not of defense, but of administration. Even so, to the men who governed from Calcutta, stability remained elusive. Afghanistan smoldered beyond the passes. Punjab trembled on its own uncertainty. The fall of Sindh, instead of ending anxiety, deepened it. The more the British expanded, the more they feared what lay just beyond their reach. The empire's map looked complete, but its heart beat faster with every new addition. In 1843, when the news of Napier's victory reached London, Parliament applauded politely, though a few voices questioned the morality of the campaign. The Directorate replied with the usual logic. Order had been restored, trade secured, civilization advanced. In the drawing rooms of Mayfair, ladies wore shawls from Sindh. In the bazaars of Hyderabad, families counted their dead. On the Indus, the sun sank over waters that now belonged to a foreign flag. The boats that once carried Baluchi traders now ferried British troops upriver, their oars cutting ripples shaped like bayonets. Behind them lay the annexed province of Sindh, and ahead, the still unbroken power of the Punjab. The frontier had moved again, and with it, the horizon of conquest. Smoke from the forges at Lahore still drifted across the plains long after Ranjit Singh's death. His empire, disciplined, wealthy, and proud, had been built around his will. Once that will was gone, the machine shuddered. Ministers plotted, queens whispered, and the Khalsa army, drilled to perfection under European officers, began to decide that it could rule as well as serve. Loyalty turned to appetite. What Ranjit had united by charisma now splintered under suspicion. Far to the south, British administrators watched through spyglasses and reports. The Punjab stood between India and the mountains, the last unbroken realm outside company control. To the men at Calcutta, it was both shield and threat, strong enough to deter invasion, dangerous enough to tempt preemptive war. No one spoke the word annexation, but its syllables hung in every sentence. For a while, restraint prevailed. The company's officers stationed along the Sutlej River posed as neighbors, not conquerors. Trade caravans moved freely. Couriers carried polite letters, and engineers measured roads that led nowhere. Not yet. Inside the Punjab, meanwhile, the Khalsa grew restless. Pay was late, commanders corrupt, and the court a nest of rival factions. In the winter of 1845, discipline broke. Without clear orders, Sikh regiments crossed the Sutlej and entrenched themselves on British ground. Diplomacy collapsed before anyone could claim to have started the war. What followed was less a campaign than a collision of equals. At Mudki, the opening engagement, both sides fought through clouds of dust and fire. The Sikh gunners, veterans of Ranjit's wars, matched the company's artillery shot for shot. Neither army expected the other to yield. Night ended the battle before decision could. The next day's dawn brought Ferozesha. Here, under the choking December haze, two armies nearly annihilated one another. The British, outnumbered and half-starved, attacked fortified positions without coordination. The Sikhs counterattacked with savage precision. For 2 nights, the fields burned. Officers led from the front until their horses fell beneath them. Sepoys fought knee-deep in blood. By morning, the Sikh lines withdrew, not routed, simply exhausted. Harding's dispatch to Calcutta called it victory. His private diary called it survival. Between the armies lay weeks of uneasy stalemate. The Sikhs regrouped north of the river. The British replenished their ranks. Neither trusted the other's truce. When spring came, the fields of the Punjab were already scorched by artillery fire. Aliwal and Sobraon decided the matter. At Sobraon, the Khalsa army fortified an immense camp behind entrenchments and a bridge of boats spanning the river. They fought until the bridge broke beneath them. Thousands drowned where they stood rather than surrender. Observers said the Sutlej ran red for miles. Lahore did not resist. Its gates opened to the conquerors, and with them entered an empire disguised as an escort. The Treaty of Lahore demanded indemnities too vast to pay and ceded swaths of land to British administration. A resident, Major Henry Lawrence, took up station at court as advisor to the 6-year-old Maharaja Duleep Singh, last son of Ranjit the Lion. His mother, Maharani Jind Kaur, retained the regency, fierce, intelligent, unbending. The company's officials admired her beauty and feared her will. They would later call her the Messalina of the Punjab, because no woman who defied them could ever be anything else. For 3 uneasy years, the fiction of partnership endured. British officers trained the Khalsa army for stability. British accountants supervised Lahore's treasury for transparency. Every word meant reduction. The Punjab remained rich, its artisans busy, its soldiers obedient. But the court's independence shrank to a formality. Beneath that quiet, resentment coiled. In 1848, the spark came from a quarrel that should have remained provincial. The governor of Multan, Diwan Mulraj, refused to pay new levies imposed by the residence office. When 2 British officers arrived to enforce compliance, they were murdered in a riot. What began as outrage in one corner of the kingdom became, within months, a revolt of the entire Punjab. The Second Anglo-Sikh War had begun. Rebellion spread faster than orders could contain it. Town after town rose under the Khalsa's old banners. Garrisons defected, supply lines vanished. British columns marched north under Sir Hugh Gough, a commander of unshakable courage and limited subtlety. His men advanced through a furnace of dust and fire, fighting the same enemy their predecessors had once admired. At Ramnagar, the battle was indecisive. At Chilianwala, it was catastrophe. Both armies battered each other senseless in the jungle thickets, losing men by the thousands. For the first time since the company's rise, victory seemed uncertain. Newspapers in London printed rumours of disaster. Then came Gujarat, February 1849, the final reckoning. The British artillery opened a bombardment so sustained that veterans compared it to a thunderstorm made of metal. The Sikh lines shattered after 3 hours, their guns captured, their cavalry scattered into the countryside. By nightfall, the once proud Khalsa laid down its arms. The rebellion's leaders surrendered within days. The Punjab, undefeated by Aurangzeb or Nadir Shah, had fallen to accountants and soldiers of a trading company. What followed was as swift as it was ruthless. The Lahore treasury, long the envy of India, was emptied under official seals. The famous Koh-i-Noor diamond, symbol of sovereignty, was gifted to Queen Victoria. Duleep Singh, the boy king, was placed under British guardianship and shipped to England, where he would grow into an English gentleman with memories no one around him could pronounce. His mother was exiled, stripped of jewels and title. The last sovereign of the Punjab became a ward of the empire. Across the plains, new flags rose over fortresses that had once guarded a frontier. The annexation of 1849 made the company master of the entire subcontinent, from the Bay of Bengal to the Khyber Pass. British engineers poured into the region to build cantonments and canals, transforming battlefields into administrative districts. The Punjab, once a sword pointed at India's heart, was turned into its shield, a land of soldiers, surveys, and silence. Calcutta celebrated. London, too, cheered the conquest as the end of danger and the dawn of security. But to those who had seen the fields at Chilianwala, it felt like a curse fulfilled. The company had reached the natural limits of geography, yet it could not stop expanding. With each annexation came new borders to fear, new armies to feed, new justifications to invent. Among the ruins of Lahore's Shalimar Gardens, an old soldier was heard to remark, "We have killed the lion, but we have set the jungle free." He was right. The peace that followed the Sikh wars was not rest, but compression, the stillness before another explosion. As British bugles echoed through the fort's courtyards, the empire that had once crept along India's coasts now stood astride its rivers, looking north toward mountains that would not stay quiet for long. Rain fell on India's new empire like consecration, washing dust from its roads but not from its conscience. The battles were over, yet the conquest continued, no longer by cannon and musket, but by document, decree, and reform. The empire that the English East India Company had carved from wars was now to be perfected by administration. At its centre stood Lord Dalhousie, a man as ambitious as any conqueror, though his battlefields were lined with paper. He believed in progress as faith and empire as duty. If there were still corners of India left untamed, he would not conquer them. He would improve them until resistance itself seemed obsolete. Dalhousie arrived in 1848, young, austere, and unshakably certain. His dispatches spoke of order, efficiency, civilization, words that would soon become synonyms for annexation. The doctrine of lapse, drafted under his direction, was the instrument of this new conquest. When a princely ruler died without a natural heir, his kingdom, he declared, must revert to the company. Adoption, a sacred tradition in Hindu law, no longer counted. Sentiment was no substitute for legality. This was not presented as aggression. It was good government. British pamphlets described it as a kindness to the governed, a release from native decay. But across India, courtiers and kings read the doctrine as a death sentence written in legal ink. Satara was the first to fall in 1848. Jhansi followed in 1853, ruled by Rani Lakshmibai, whose intelligence and composure could not soften the final verdict. Nagpur was absorbed the same year, its treasury sealed before the late ruler's pyre had cooled. Even Baghat and Sambalpur, small hill principalities barely visible on a map, were swallowed in the name of reform. Each proclamation was read aloud to the accompaniment of military bands and followed by silence, a kingdom erased without a shot fired. Dalhousie saw no contradiction between conquest and conscience. He saw India as a laboratory for enlightened rule, a place where moral purpose could march in step with mercantile gain. In his vision, good government required more than discipline. It required infrastructure. The age of iron had arrived. Across Bengal and Bombay, the first railways cut through rice fields and villages, the rails glinting under tropical sun. Peasants called them fire carts, unsure whether they carried men or spirits. Stations rose beside temples and wells. Ticket offices replaced caravanserais. To Dalhousie, these were monuments to progress. To the farmers who watched their fields divided by embankments, they were signs of intrusion. The electric telegraph followed, a web of wires strung over palm groves and deserts, linking Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay in a pulse of metal. Messages that once took weeks now travelled in minutes. Officials celebrated it as the end of distance. Some Indians whispered that the British had trapped the lightning itself, and that such power could not be innocent. The postal system came next, stamps printed with Queen Victoria's profile, letters delivered on schedule across a subcontinent. Schools and universities multiplied, teaching an English curriculum that replaced Sanskrit epics with Latin grammar and Indian philosophy with Benthamite law. Dalhousie's modern India began to take shape. a network of rails, cables, offices, and courts that bound a continent more tightly than any army ever could. But even as the Governor-General spoke of progress, he governed through control. The empire's roads were designed to move troops, not travelers. Its railways served cannon as much as commerce. New codes standardized taxation and justice, translating the fluid customs of 1,000 communities into a single, rigid language. Land was now measured, priced, and taxed with relentless precision. For those who could not pay, there was no forgiveness, only auction. The old order of landholders, the talukdars, saw their estates slip away to moneylenders or company clerks. Dalhousie's reforms reached into homes as well as fields. In villages along the Ganges, British regulations touched everything from irrigation to inheritance. Traditional councils were replaced by magistrates, their verdicts delivered in English and translated afterward to the accused. In cities, missionaries built schools beside mosques, offering instruction as salvation. Conversion was rare, but fear of it was everywhere. The company declared itself neutral in religion, yet its officers spoke easily of providence. To many Indians, it seemed the English were not content to rule the land. They wished to rule the soul. Only one great province remained nominally independent, Awadh or Oudh, the glittering heart of North India. Its capital, Lucknow, was a city of gardens, palaces, and poetry, ruled by the Nawab Wajid Ali Shah, a patron of music and verse whose refinement masked his helplessness. Awadh had been allied with the British for generations, its armies and revenues sustaining their wars. But Dalhousie's inspectors, sent under pretext of audit, painted a damning portrait. Misrule, corruption, extravagance. The words were ready. Only the timing remained. In February 1856, the proclamation was issued. Awadh was annexed in the interests of good governance. The Nawab was deposed, granted a pension, and escorted away by his own guards. His courtiers were dismissed, his army disbanded, his treasury confiscated. Lucknow's people lined the streets as he departed in tears. "I never sought power," he told them, "only peace and poetry." For the British, his removal marked the triumph of administration. For Awadh's soldiers, it marked betrayal. They had served the company faithfully. Now their homeland was gone. The annexation completed the lattice of empire from the Bay of Bengal to the Khyber. The company controlled every great river, every road, every port. Its army numbered more than 300,000 men, 3/4 of them Indian, led by officers who often knew little of their languages but everything of their drill. Cantonments rose outside every major city, rows of whitewashed barracks, parade grounds, chapels, and clubs where English life persisted behind walls. Around them sprawled bazaars that serviced the garrisons, tailors, cooks, and women, all living by the pulse of the regimental drum. Among the sepoys, unease began to stir. The new Enfield rifle, issued in limited numbers, required cartridges greased with animal fat. Some said beef, others pork. Both rumors struck at faith. Officers laughed off the concerns as superstition. The soldiers whispered that this was deliberate pollution, a test of obedience to foreign gods. The rumor spread faster than any order could contain it. Even those untouched by the army felt the tremor. Dispossessed nobles, ruined landlords, and impoverished artisans formed the quiet chorus of discontent. The new economy had no place for their pride. The courts ruled against them in languages they could not read. The railways carried strangers across lands they once ruled. The poets of Awadh began to write elegies for kingdoms that no longer existed. "The garden has not withered," one wrote, "but the gardener has gone blind." Dalhousie, meanwhile, governed from Calcutta with charts and statistics. He saw famine declining, trade increasing, and the revenue books balanced. His letters home glowed with certainty. "India has never been so tranquil," he wrote in 1856. He meant it sincerely. But beneath that tranquil surface, tension coiled like a spring. The same railways that moved trade could also move troops. The same telegraph that carried orders could carry panic. Villagers saw officials measuring land where their ancestors had prayed. Sepoys saw chaplains where priests once blessed. Progress had turned from wonder to threat. When Dalhousie finally left India, sick and exhausted, he believed he had completed the work of empire. He had built a system so efficient it could almost govern itself. What he did not see, what no one yet saw, was that he had also built the conditions of its rebellion. The empire he left behind glittered with order and confidence. Railways hummed, telegraphs sang, cantonments gleamed white against the dust. Yet in the villages of Awad, men spoke in whispers. In barracks at Meerut and Barrackpore, soldiers prayed with unease. The company had tightened its net so thoroughly that it could not feel the tremor building beneath it. When the first spark came, it would find the air already dry. Winter of 1857 brought strange murmurs to India's barracks. At Barrackpore, Meerut, and Ambala, sepoys whispered about the new Enfield rifle, its cartridge rumoured to be greased with fat from cows and pigs. The official orders said nothing of it, but gossip needed no proof. A soldier's hands, if defiled by such grease, would betray both faiths at once. The cartridge was to be bitten open before loading. What might have been a technical detail became a spark in powder. Officers laughed off the fears as absurd, yet the sepoy's world was one of ritual, not convenience. Each man carried his caste on his tongue and his soul in his hands. The company, impatient for efficiency, dismissed these as superstitions. The soldiers watched, silent, loyal, and listening. In January, small fires of defiance flickered. At Dum Dum, cartridges were refused. At Barrackpore, murmurs rose into mutiny. A sepoy named Mangal Pandey stepped forward, musket in hand, and fired at his officer. His comrades wavered between fear and admiration. The shot missed, but history had found its signal. Pandey was hanged, the regiment disbanded, the news spread faster than any telegraph. Each punishment, meant as warning, became invitation. By spring, the wind itself seemed to carry rebellion. Letters written in red powder, chapatis, as the English called them, passed from village to village, each one a summons none could read, but all understood. In bazaars and temples, rumours mingled with prophecy. The British Raj would end at its 100th year. White men would melt in the sun, the rivers would rise. Fear travelled both ways. Officers slept with pistols under pillows. Native townsfolk locked doors before dusk. Then came Meerut. On May 10th, 85 sepoys of the 3rd Light Cavalry, imprisoned for refusing cartridges, were paraded in chains before their comrades. When the evening bugle sounded, the garrison turned on its officers. Prison doors burst open, cantonments burned. European families fled toward Delhi, pursued by rumour and smoke. The revolt was no longer whispers, it was war. Through the night, the rebels rode east, guided less by command than by instinct. To Delhi, the old capital, the ghost of empires past. When they reached its gates on the morning of May 11th, they demanded that the Mughal emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar be their king. The old poet, 80 and weary, hesitated. For half a lifetime he had ruled a palace, not a realm. Now rebellion asked him to rule a continent. Still, the cry outside his window left no choice. "So be it," he said softly. By noon, the red flag of the Mughals flew again over the Red Fort. The news raced like wildfire. At Kanpur, Lucknow, Jhansi, Bareilly, and Allahabad, regiments turned their guns on their officers. In some towns, the killing was swift and merciless. In others, confused and chaotic. Civilians fled to churches, to riverboats, to walls too thin for protection. The empire of paper, of codes, ledgers, and treaties, dissolved overnight into panic. Delhi became the heart of the uprising. Inside its walls gathered soldiers, artisans, priests, and outlaws. A storm without compass. The sepoys fought under banners painted with crescents and tridents, while the poets of the court composed verses of vengeance. Bahadur Shah, once a writer of ghazals, became an emperor again, in name, if not in power. His sons commanded the defenses. His proclamations called for the expulsion of the foreigner. Yet even in rebellion, India remained divided. Some princes hesitated, others stayed loyal. Still others waited to see which side would win. To the south, in Kanpur, the sepoys proclaimed Nana Sahib, the adopted son of the deposed Maratha Peshwa, as their leader. He promised justice for old wrongs, pensions denied, kingdoms stolen under the doctrine of lapse. His words stirred men who had never seen a Peshwa's court, but remembered its name like a prayer. The siege of Kanpur began under the rising heat of June. Farther east, Lucknow braced for its own ordeal. Sir Henry Lawrence, the British resident, fortified the residency compound, gathering civilians and loyal soldiers behind makeshift walls. Outside, thousands of Awadhi rebels surrounded the city, their drums echoing through the night. The siege would become legend, a struggle not of victory but endurance. In Jhansi, Rani Lakshmibai, widow of the annexed kingdom, watched events unfold with both fear and purpose. She had begged for her son's inheritance and been refused. Now rebellion offered a cruel kind of justice. When British troops approached, she raised her own banner. "We fight for our honor," she declared, "and for the land of our birth." Her riders took oath beside her palace walls. To the English, she would become the Jezebel of India. To her people, she would become freedom itself. Everywhere, the lines of loyalty blurred. Some sepoys guarded their officers, even as others shot theirs. Some villages sheltered fugitives, others betrayed them for bounty. The rebellion was not one war, but 100. Each fought for reasons that overlapped and collided. Peasants rose against landlords, landlords against tax collectors, priests against missionaries, soldiers against command. India seemed to fracture and unite at once. The company's communication lines faltered. Telegraph poles were cut down, railways torn up, couriers killed on the roads. In Calcutta, Governor-General Lord Canning received fragments of news days late. Each dispatch was worse than the last. His council urged vengeance, but there was no clear enemy, only fire spreading through dry grass. By June, half the northern provinces lay beyond company control. The smoke of burning cantonments drifted over the Ganges plains. In some cities, European survivors barricaded themselves in warehouses, firing through windows until ammunition ran out. At Kanpur, a truce turned to massacre. At Lucknow, the siege tightened. At Delhi, British columns gathered on the ridge outside the city, their cannon aimed at the domes of the Red Fort. And yet, even amid chaos, patterns emerged. The rebellion's heartlands were the very regions most reformed by Dalhousie's hand. Awadh, Bundelkhand, the Ganges plain. The new order had broken the old without replacing its trust. The soldiers fought for faith, for pay, for vengeance. The peasants fought because the taxes had become unbearable. The princes fought to reclaim vanished crowns. What the British saw as treason was, to many, the return of memory. By the end of June, the company still held its strongholds, Calcutta, Bombay, Madras. But the air of invincibility was gone. The empire that claimed to have civilized India now found itself defending its own civility behind barricades. From the Himalayas to the Deccan, the monsoon clouds gathered thick and black, and thunder rolled across the plains. Beneath their sound, the armies of rebellion and retribution prepared to meet. The century of company rule had begun in trade and treaties. It now trembled beneath its own creation. The fire had started in rumor and ritual, and by summer's end, it would burn through every illusion of control. The monsoon broke over India as if the sky itself had joined the war. Rain flooded camps, soaked powder, and turned roads into rivers of clay. Yet neither side could wait for clearer skies. Delhi, once the jewel of empires, had become the rebellion's fortress and symbol. The British, encamped on the ridge north of the city, stared daily at its crimson walls and the domes of the Jama Masjid shimmering through gun smoke. Inside, the rebels proclaimed faith and vengeance. Outside, the company's columns tightened their grip. General Archdale Wilson commanded the siege lines, a patchwork army of Europeans, Gurkhas, and Sikh regiments drawn from the Punjab. Cannon roared day and night, shaking the ground like an earthquake. For every breach made by artillery, the monsoon mended it with mud. Fever killed as many men as bullets. Still, the assault in September could no longer be delayed. At dawn on September 14th, the bugles sounded. Engineers blew open the Kashmiri Gate, and storming parties surged through the smoke. The fighting that followed was not battle, but butchery. House to house, street to street, sabres against bayonets, neither side asking for quarter. When evening came, Delhi burned. The Red Fort fell without ceremony. The Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar fled toward Humayun's tomb, where he was captured days later. His sons were executed at a roadside by Major William Hodson, who displayed their bodies as warning. The empire that began under the Mughals ended in that guttered dusk. Delhi's fall did not end the rebellion. It only unshackled the vengeance that had been waiting. Across the Ganges plain, British officers raised columns of retribution, mobile armies of infantry, cavalry, and cannon that left blackened villages in their wake. The word justice became interchangeable with reprisal. Anyone caught with a musket risked execution. Anyone sheltering rebels faced the gallows. The company's flag flew again, but it was stained by the smoke of its own fury. South along the Ganges, Kanpur lay in ruins. The siege there had ended with betrayal and massacre. European prisoners, women and children among them, slaughtered after a false truce. When British troops re-entered the city under General Havelock, the river ran red for days. Officers wept as they fought. Others did not bother to hide their rage. The Bibigar well, where the dead had been thrown, became a symbol, first of horror, then of revenge. Prisoners were tied to cannon mouths and blown apart. No sentence was too severe, no cruelty too extravagant. The rebellion had stripped all restraint from both sides. At Lucknow, the tragedy unfolded more slowly. The residency compound, under siege since June, had become a tomb defended by the living. For months, soldiers, civilians, and servants endured hunger and bombardment. The walls crumbled, disease raged, yet the defenders held. News travelled by rumour until, one evening in September, the thunder of guns approached from the east. General Havelock and Sir Henry Outram had fought their way from Kanpur to relieve the garrison. When they broke through, the survivors cheered, then fell silent, realizing that their rescuers were now besieged with them. Relief had become reinforcement in captivity. Winter brought a new army under Sir Colin Campbell, the last hope of coordination in a war that had become chaos. In November, Campbell's forces finally reached Lucknow, their advance marked by the boom of artillery echoing across the Gomti River. The rescue succeeded, but the city was left half in ruins, half in enemy hands. Only in March 1858 would it be retaken entirely, its palaces turned into barracks, its gardens flattened for parade grounds. The proud capital of Awadh was reduced to rubble, order restored, life extinguished. Farther south and west, rebellion flickered on in Jhansi and Gwalior. There rode Rani Lakshmibai, the widow queen who had once petitioned for her son's inheritance and been denied. Now she led her troops in armour, sword in hand, her presence both legend and defiance. Pursued by Sir Hugh Rose, she fought through Bundelkhand with a skill that astonished her pursuers. At Kalpi, her army was broken. At Gwalior, she fell in battle, shot through the chest as she charged a cannon. Even her enemies buried her with honour. To Britain, she was a rebel. To India, she became the face of resistance, courage carved in fire. By summer of 1858, the rebellion's last flames burned in the plains of Bihar and the jungles of central India. Tantia Tope, Lakshmibai's ally, continued guerrilla war until captured and hanged. Columns under Campbell, Rose, and Hope Grant marched from province to province, crushing remnants that refused to vanish. The cost was staggering. Villages emptied, crops destroyed, thousands executed without trial. The rebellion, born in faith and outrage, died in exhaustion. In the cities, vengeance turned bureaucratic. Military courts sat in tents, delivering judgment by the hour. Sentences were carried out in public squares, the crack of rifles echoing against church bells. In Calcutta, editors who had once praised reform now demanded blood. Clemency is cruelty, one newspaper wrote. Punishment is mercy. The empire agreed. Even as order returned, the victory felt hollow. The company had regained its territory, but lost its illusion of permanence. Among the British, fear replaced arrogance. Among Indians, obedience turned to resentment. The two societies that had once shared an uneasy partnership were now divided by memory. The rebellion's graves lay unmarked. Its lessons could not be forgotten. When Bahadur Shah Zafar was brought to trial in Delhi, the proceeding was more ceremony than law. He confessed to little, pleaded for nothing, and was sentenced to exile in Rangoon. There, in a damp cell, the last emperor of India spent his final years writing poetry. "Do not bury me in foreign soil," he wrote, "for this is not my homeland." His wish was denied. His death in 1862 would mark the quiet end of the dynasty that had once ruled from the Atlantic to the Arakan. By mid-1858, the rebellion was declared suppressed. Columns returned to cantonments. The courts fell silent. Yet in the minds of those who had witnessed it, something fundamental had shifted. The empire that emerged was no longer a company of merchants, but a state born of fear, centralized, militarized, and absolute. In the parched fields of Awadh, the wind still carried the smell of smoke. At Delhi, the great bazaar reopened under the gaze of British patrols. The guns fell silent, but the silence was uneasy. What had been retaken by force could never again be ruled by faith. The British had regained the north. but at the price of innocence. The rebellion had ended. The reckoning had just begun. When the last columns returned from the north, India lay silent beneath its monsoon skies. The rebellion had been crushed, but the empire it had shaken would never be the same. Even London sensed it. The company that had once ruled a continent from a counting house was now too infamous to survive. In the wake of blood and rumour, Britain reclaimed its creation. The Government of India Act of 1858 ended 2 centuries of corporate rule. The East India Company, which had begun as a merchant venture under Queen Elizabeth, ceased to exist as a sovereign power. Its stockholders were compensated, its directors dismissed, its armies absorbed into the British Crown. A new hierarchy replaced the old. A Secretary of State for India sat in London, directing policy through a council. In Calcutta, the Governor-General became Viceroy, the monarch's personal representative. Trade had built empire. Now bureaucracy would preserve it. The transition was quiet but profound. Orders still bore the same seals. The regiments still marched to the same drums. Yet the tone had changed. The language of commerce, profit, revenue, efficiency gave way to the language of duty and destiny. Britain no longer spoke of shareholders. It spoke of civilization. The fiction of partnership ended. India was now an imperial possession. The first viceroy, Lord Canning, governed in the shadow of the rebellion. His policy, mocked at the time as Clemency Canning, aimed to temper vengeance with reconciliation. Land confiscated in Awadh was partly restored. Loyal princes were rewarded with new titles. Courts were restructured to include a handful of Indian judges. The Queen's Proclamation of 1858, read in both English and Urdu, promised equality before law and respect for faith. "We hold ourselves bound," it declared, "to the natives of our Indian territories, by the same obligations of duty which bind us to all our subjects." It was an oath of restraint and a monument to fear. Behind its language of peace, the reorganization moved swiftly. The army that had revolted was dismantled and rebuilt. Ratios were rewritten. Never again would Indian soldiers outnumber Europeans by so many. Artillery was placed entirely under British control. Recruitment shifted northward to Punjab, Nepal, and the frontier hills. The sepoys of Awadh and Bihar, once the backbone of the Bengal army, were dispersed or dismissed. Loyalty was no longer assumed, it was engineered. Administration followed the same logic. Provinces that had once reported to Calcutta were bound into tighter chains. The civil service, now a formal institution, not a patronage, became the empire's spine. A cadre of exam-passed Englishmen ruling districts larger than counties. Their letters home spoke of isolation and fatigue, of sunsets over rivers and files piled high. They were missionaries of paperwork, convinced that order was virtue. Beneath them, Indian clerks filled the offices, interpreters of both language and law. The partnership was unequal but necessary. Governance as collaboration under duress. Beyond the desks and drills, the landscape of empire transformed. The railway system, born of Dalhousie's vision, expanded in iron arcs that now linked Bombay to Delhi, Calcutta to Lahore. Telegraph lines crisscrossed the plains, binding provinces with invisible thread. What had been invention became infrastructure. What had been curiosity became control. Trains carried grain, troops, and gossip. Telegraphs carried command and panic alike. The empire became a network, as impersonal as it was efficient. The princes who had survived the rebellion were restored to their thrones, but only as tributaries. The doctrine of lapse was abolished, yet its shadow lingered. Under the new system of indirect rule, Indian rulers governed their states under British supervision. Their armies disbanded, their revenues audited. Residencies sprouted beside palaces, each a quiet embassy of the crown. The titles of Maharaja, Nawab, and Raja endured, but the power behind them had evaporated. Their loyalty was now a spectacle. On the frontier, the empire learned new habits of vigilance. Expeditions into the northwest frontier became routine. Ambela in 1863, the Black Mountain campaigns, and the endless skirmishes beyond the Khyber Pass. Each victory seemed to widen the border rather than secure it. In Afghanistan, 2 wars would be fought within 40 years, each ending with treaties written in sand. The Durand Line of 1893 drew a border that satisfied no one, a scar across mountains that had never belonged to any map. Within India itself, governance grew ceremonial. The British built cities to mirror their pride. Simla rose in the Himalayas as a summer capital. Bombay and Calcutta glittered with Gothic arches and gaslight. In 1877, Lord Lytton presided over the Delhi Imperial Assemblage, where Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India. The ceremony unfolded on a field of tents beneath a golden canopy, elephants draped in silk, vassal princes bowing in order of precedence. The empire celebrated itself as destiny fulfilled. To its rulers, the rebellion was history. To those it ruled, it was memory. Beneath the pageantry, the machinery of control deepened. The Indian Penal Code standardized punishment. The Education Acts produced clerks fluent in English and loyal to the idea of empire. Missionaries built schools, engineers dug canals. Census takers counted millions who had never been counted before. The Raj, as it came to be called, was both spectacle and system. Railway whistles, parade grounds, and the drone of bureaucratic precision. Still, in quiet corners, another current stirred. From universities and printing presses emerged voices that spoke of reform, representation, and rights. English education, meant to breed servants, had also produced critics. They read Mill and Burke, Shakespeare and the Vedas, and began to imagine India as a nation rather than an empire. The seeds were small and scattered, but they took root in the soil, watered by contradiction. By the 1890s, the transformation was complete. The British Raj stretched from Karachi to Calcutta, from Kashmir to Madras, a single administrative machine of rail, telegraph, and regiment. In London, politicians spoke of it as the jewel in the crown. In India, poets spoke of it as a mirror of loss. The company's age of traders and adventurers had given way to an age of clerks and soldiers, men who ruled not for fortune, but for permanence. In the grand hall of the Delhi Durbar, a British officer once wrote that, "We have brought peace to India." He did not hear the silence that followed, the kind born not of harmony, but of exhaustion. The empire had endured its reckoning and survived it, but something human had drained away in the process. The century that began with merchants at Surat ended with monarchs at Delhi. The flag that flew over India's forts was no longer that of a company, but of a crown. Its triumph lay not in the glory of conquest, but in the illusion of eternity.